This is the Ramana Maharshi Upadesa Saram satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and to deeply inquire into the self. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. Let me just adjust my screen. Okay. Welcome. I'm Richard Clarke, hosting this satsang. I'm a seeker, like you, sharing what we love. I've been blessed with years of deep teaching and practice that I bring to this satsang. This week I continue with the Ramana Maharshi text, Upadesa Saram, Essence of Instruction, or Upadesa Undiyar in Tamil. I'll cover verses 8 through 10, in which Ramana deals with Bhakti, or devotion. I'm using Professor Swami translation of Upadesa Saram. Here are Ramana Maharshi's words. Verse 8. Better than viewing him as other, indeed the noblest attitude of all is to hold him as the I within, the very I. While Ramana is talking here about a path that could be considered as preliminary to self-inquiry, devotion, even here he leads us to the highest, which is seeing that God and yourself are one and the same. He is teaching about bhakti, about devotion, and right away he tells you to hold him as the I, to hold God as your very identity, as yourself. So your worship, your devotion is not to something or somebody outside of yourself, but to yourself. How extraordinary! Most of religion is filled with gods to worship outside of you. In the start of your spiritual practice, this is beneficial since the mind can only know objects. Mental knowing is always about something, some object of knowledge. So God is the highest object, the highest thing that can be known. At most, these religious views might say that you are a spark of the fire that is God. Instead, Ramana says to hold him as the I within, the very I. Hold God, or whatever is the highest, as your very being. You are not separate. You are the same existence that is called God. Now verse 9. Abidance in pure being, transcending thought through love intense, is the very essence of supreme devotion. Now Ramana tells us that the best way to love God is to be God, transcending thought, and, though unstated, transcending the ego with abiding in pure being, and to be carried away by your love. He really opens the door to self-inquiry with these passages about bhakti, about devotion. This love is love from within that grows naturally. It needs no rituals of expression. It is just natural. It is love that reaches beyond your ego self and to your real self. Verse 10, absorption in the heart of being whence we sprang is the path of action, of devotion, of union, and of knowledge. Absorption in the heart of being. This is the goal of all spiritual practice, to move past the small self and into that which is free and boundless, filled with bliss and happiness that does not come and go. Ramana tells us we came from that, so that is who we are now, at this very moment, and we will forever be that. Then he declares that this is the goal of all four spiritual practices, the four yogas or margas. It is here that all paths lead, absorption in the heart of being. Action, devotion, union, and knowledge. Karma yoga, bhakti yoga, raja yoga, and jnana yoga all lead to the self. And now we have some videos to watch. First will be from Swami Adysakti talking about these same verses.
Hello, namaste. Welcome to the next episode of Upadesa. This one is kind of tricky, so I'm going to have to rely on my notes a lot. I hope you don't mind me reading off of the notes, because in this episode we're going to go into verses 8 through 10. And this is where Ramana introduces the philosophy of Advaita. Advaita means non-duality. That doesn't mean oneness. The opposite of two is not one. The opposite of two is indeterminate. Advaita. Some people try to read it into oneness, but that's really not correct. So let's summarize these verses, 8 through 10. First of all, in verse 8, Ramana says that rather than meditating on God as different from oneself, one should meditate on God as being oneself. In other words, God within us. Like that. So this is the key to explaining how nishkamya karma and bhakti ultimately lead to meditation on the self, Brahman. In the next verse, he declares that the actual meaning of bhakti is to concentrate and worship one's own self. In the next verse, verse 9, Bhagavan declares that the real meaning of bhakti is to concentrate on and worship God as oneself. And this is the actual meaning of para bhakti, the supreme bhakti, highest bhakti. In verse 10, he concludes that to abide in the self is transcendental to meditation. And this is the real aim of not only karma yoga, Naishkarmya karma yoga, but also bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, and raja yoga. So in other words, the principle of Advaita unifies all the paths of yoga into one. Now normally we have the adherents of different types of yoga being very sectarian and trying to prove that their particular path is the best. But actually, just like one can approach a mountain from the north, from the east, from the south, or from the west, these four major paths of yoga, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, raja yoga, dhyana yoga, are actually simply different paths to reach the same point. And that point is aham brahmasme, soham, I am Brahman, I am that. Brahman is the self. Well, look at it from the other point of view. Brahman is everything. So if Brahman is everything and within everything and is the root substance of all existences, then Brahman is in us too. And if there is something that appears to be different from Brahman, that is illusion. So that is the main point of Advaita philosophy. Not that it's all one. That's a distortion and an oversimplification. Because as we'll see later, well, I don't want to give away my big conclusion yet. So let's go into the verses one by one. First, verse 8. Rather than anya bhava, ananya bhava, done with the conviction he is I, is indeed the best among all the various kinds of meditation. So anya means something else. Anya means God is different from the self. Now, all the various religious paths, including the paths of bhakti, meditation, and so on, done as a religious path, hold that the self and God are different. So rather than use the loaded term God, I prefer the term Brahman, because Brahman does not have all the philosophical, theological, and traditional baggage that comes along with the word God. God is a very anthropomorphic term. It conjures up an image of an old man in the sky looking disapprovingly at everybody and ready anytime to send somebody to hell for eternity. It's a horrible idea. God isn't like that at all. God is, in Advaita conception, one's very self, the innermost core, the most inner of the inward. So, in that conception, then God is within everyone and everything that exists is part of God. So, I'll be expanding on this image and this idea a little bit later in the video. So an important point that he brings up here is that one should not meditate on the thought, I am God. Because anything that's a thought is different from the thing that's thought about. Just like words. Words are different from the things they represent. Of course, some people identify or objectify words, and they try to make different words the real things that they talk about, but they're not. Really, they're just symbols. So, we shouldn't be attached to words, and in the same way, we shouldn't be attached to ideas. Even important ideas like I am that, or he is I, or any of the Mahavakyas, or great sayings of the Vedas. These are only to guide our meditations. So if we're not supposed to meditate on the thought, then what are we supposed to meditate on? The experience. The experience that I am consciousness. I am Brahman. I am the root substance of everything that be. And that will bring us to the experience of I am He, I am that, and so on, that the Vedas are pointing towards. Remember, any idea, any word is only a pointer towards something real. And so we shouldn't get all hung up on the pointer, but go and take a look at the experience that it points to. That's the real purpose of meditation. Because after all, we can't be in meditation 24 hours a day. Can't sit there with our eyes closed and ignore the real world. We still have to eat, work, and so on. So what is the point of meditation then? It's simply to establish in us the right view. And once that right view is established, then there's no more need for meditation. We actually transcend meditation. And we get to a state that's called post-meditation. More on that in just a minute. Oh, so finally, in this verse also Bhagavan reveals how these four yogas become one. Because each of them is simply a pointer toward a certain experience. That experience is the experience of the self. Self with a capital S. So next, verse 9. By the strength of such ananya bhava, or self-inquiry, abiding in the state of being, which transcends meditation, alone is the truth of supreme devotion. So if God, Brahman, the Supreme, is everything, and is in everything, and is also in us and is us, then to meditate on the self is the supreme devotion. To meditate on some symbol like a deity or a name or an idea about God is secondary or tertiary to meditating on the self. And in this way, all the paths of yoga become one. So this is the real practice all the yogas are aiming at, is simply abiding in the self. This abiding in the self is extremely pleasant. I discovered it one day. I remember I was sitting on a park bench in Mexico City. And I was thinking, what am I really? I'm consciousness, right? So what if I just become conscious of consciousness? And I started looking at myself, contemplating myself. I'm different from the body, I'm different from the mind. I'm pure consciousness. I am the light that illuminates all these objects and allows me to sense the world, to experience the life. And I began to get so happy, so blissful, just from thinking about it, actually, and then actually doing it, actually turning around the mind to look at itself, to think of itself, turning around the consciousness to appear in at itself. This is a very, very pleasant experience, and it only gets better as we get deeper into it. So this idea that he is I is in the beginning a conviction. It is more or less an assumption. God is myself? It seems a little bit counterintuitive at first, because after all, myself is different from other people's self, apparently. And on the surface it seems like, well, we should all be separate and different, right? But if God was everybody and in everything, wouldn't we all be the same? Well, not necessarily. Well, we'll get to that later too. What it really means is that we are qualitatively identical, pure consciousness, pure being. And that all of us are looking out through different mirrors, different lenses at the world. And those lenses color the world differently for each of us. The mirrors reflect differently, although the nature of a mirror is always the same. It reflects different scenes depending on what's placed in front of it. So even though consciousness is the same in everyone, it reflects the different objects that it encounters and appears to be different. But it's not the mirror, it's what it's reflecting that's different. So, what results from this practice of ananya bhava, of self-reflection or self-contemplation, is that the meditator disappears. There's no more subject-object dichotomy. If I'm meditating on myself, the subject and the object are the same. There's no more duality, non-duality. See? And then one realizes that, well, the quality of consciousness in me isn't different from the quality of consciousness in anything else. So again, there's no difference between myself and another self. Again, non-duality. So this leads to some very interesting experiences and conclusions. Oh, and finally, since God, or Brahman, is nothing but the real self in everything, that this kind of meditation, this kind of experience or contemplation is the highest form of yoga. Verse 10. Abiding, having subsided in the place of arising, in one's source, the real self. That is karma, desireless action, and bhakti, devotion. That is yoga, union with God, and jnana, true knowledge. So this is the practice that transcends meditation. And by this practice, the mind, or the self with a small s, the ego, becomes merged in the place of its arising. Ego emerges from mind, and mind arises from consciousness. And consciousness arises from Brahman. So when we settle the small self with a small s in the great self with a capital S, Brahman, then this individuality, this separateness, the existence of the doer comes to an end. And so this is the state of no mind, non-doing, enlightenment, nirvana, whatever you want to call it, salvation, moksha. This is the state that all the yogas, all the spiritual disciplines aim at. So, of course, they create a spectrum of many different stages. But here, Ramana is focusing on the ultimate stage, the stage where one realizes the final insight. And what is that insight? Well, we talked before about consciousness being like a mirror, right? So, if I'm on this side of the mirror, I can see the objects reflected in the mirror. And I say, oh, that mirror is reflecting those objects. But if I go on the other side of the mirror, then I become aware of the source of those objects and the mirror itself. Just like a one-way mirror. You know, you can see through a one-way mirror from this side, but not from this side. So from this side, it looks like an ordinary mirror, and you can't see through to the other side. But when you're on the other side of it, you can't see through it. So you can see not only the objects being reflected in it, but you can see the mirror itself and know that the mirror is actually yourself. So namaste, Om Tat Sat, Om Harihi Om.
And now we will hear from my teacher, Nome, who gives a discourse, Deep Peace.
Deep, ever-present peace is of the self, which is ever existent. It is uncaused, utterly non-dependent. The unchangeable peace lies in the immutability of the self. If the peace seems as if it is disturbed, or not fully one's experience, why then, if you simply inquire, as Sri Bhagavan advises, as for whom this disturbance is, it is resolved. The one for whom the apparent disturbance or lack of peace is himself the disturbance. But inquiring into his nature, he is found not to exist at all. And all that actually exists is the ever-present self of the nature of Satchidananda, being, consciousness, bliss. Perfect peace is of the self, he said. To realize fully this perfect peace, one's sense of identity must be absorbed so that you abide in the self as the self. Such abidance consists of the profound inner knowledge of what is actually true and certain about you. Regard only that as you, which is forever changelessly so. Such cannot possibly be anything bodily or mental. What is changelessly so is beginningless and endless. What is changelessly so alone actually exists. What appears and disappears for someone, and is not self-existent. For whom is all this appearance? For whom will it vanish? The non-appearing, the birthless, the never-vanishing, the deathless, is peace itself. Search for this inwardly in such a manner that you wholly identify with it. For this is indeed natural for you. Deep peace. It is the very nature of your being. Deep peace. It is the unchanging consciousness itself. In truth, it is never disturbed, and it can never be destroyed. Though its manifestations may appear myriad, it is actually remaining unmanifested. Not to be perceived in an objective manner, but to be realized in self-knowledge. Take the time to know yourself, and you will be at peace.
All right. Now we will take a little time for inquiry. Breathe in and out with long, slow breaths. Feel the breath as it comes in, as it goes out. Feel your mind quiet. Now notice that you exist. You exist, and you know you exist without feeling it or thinking about it. You just know. Already, this knowledge is beyond body feeling and mental thought. So we're going to inquire. Now, fill your mind with the thought, I am that. If there is another thought other than this, just dismiss it. Let it go. Who am I? Unbounded peace am I. Changeless being am I. I'm always the knower and never the known. Now once more inquire, who am I? What is the nature of my existence? All right. Let's close with a chant. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Thank you for letting me share this teaching with you. Next week I'll continue with a review of Upadesa Saram, the essence of the teaching. Namaste.
Namaste.